Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now. I sit within the knowledge and practice part of the organisation, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members worldwide, working right across the property life cycle, whether that's land, planning and development, construction, valuation, brokerage, finance, property management, building surveying, asset management. It's a really wide canvas upon which data and tech is having a huge impact. And indeed, our members work right across the major asset types, whether that's land itself, residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. And today I'm really proud to have the members of the Open Property Data Association with us today to explain how that came about and the background and the work they're doing around upfront information in the residential sector in the UK. So it'd be great to get introductions from all of you before we get into the bits and bytes and what it all actually means. So Maria, perhaps a bit of a quick backstory from you.
Yeah, thank you. Lovely to be here. So my background is actually in mortgage lending. Most people know me from mortgage distribution and mortgage origination with some big lenders and some building societies. And I was part of the team who created Atom Bank, which was the UK's first digital bank, which was pretty cool. I now do consultancy work. I help other people to do digital transformation. I'm a non-exec director with a bank and with a few prop tech startups. And I also now chair the Open Property Data Association, which came from the technology working group of home buying and selling, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a bit later.
Thanks, Maria. And Ed, moving across to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Yes, I'm Ed Molyneux. I guess I'm a tech entrepreneur by trade. My previous company was a company called Free Agent more in the fintech space, which I founded and grew. In this context, I sort of wear two hats. One is as part of the Open Property Data Association. I'm on the exec committee with Maria, and I've done a lot of work with her on the initiation and development of the Property Data Trust Framework. So that's one hat, and then my other hat is as a CTO of a new startup called Moverly, and we're working in the consumer-facing residential property transaction space, building on the trust framework to provide trusted data for consumers to rely on in smoothing out property transactions. Thanks,
Ed. And last but not least, Tim.
Andrew, thank you. Tim Main. I was an estate agent, and then I now CEO of PIP Limited, which provides data rooms for estate agents for each property in a sale through the estate agent, and I chair the home buying and selling group logbook group.
Thanks, Tim. Well, it's good that you mentioned home buying and selling group there, because obviously there's a bit of history and a backstory here before we talk about the Open Property Data Association. It'd be great to get your perspective and a bit of history, Tim, about who are the home buying and selling group.
Well, the home buying and selling group is a voluntary organisation with over 150 participants that was set up by Kate Faulkner, who's a property influencer is probably about the right word. She was as frustrated as everyone with the time it was taking for conveyancing to proceed, which I think people are talking about 150 days nowadays. And when I started selling houses too many years ago to remember, it was 28 days. And then those were the days of snail mail and all the rest. And so it's just got longer and longer and longer, and it's not fit for purpose in today's digital world. So she with the ministry at the time, she cajoled a lot of people, with Beth Rudolph from the Conveyancing Association being a leading light as well, got people from across the property sector. So it's not just agents, it's not just solicitors, it's surveyors, mortgage brokers, portals, you name it. She got a representative from everybody who's given their time completely free to discuss and look at ways of improving the home buying and selling process.
So as you say, I mean, you explained really well about how the group came about. It really is, its raison d'etre is to improve the process, isn't it? So
that's its sole focus, really.
Exactly. Maria, moving to you, you know, when we look at what's now evolved into this Open Property Data Association, could you explain really what are the kind of fundamental problems we're trying to solve with this?
Yeah, so home buying and selling have looked at lots of things that impact the journey, not just transactions, but they've been involved in all sorts of things like how-to guides that consumers see on the government website are written by the team, by participants. When COVID happened, the how to move house safely during COVID and how to get the housing market moving again. So they've tackled quite a few things, leasehold issues, all sorts of stuff, building safety. And 2 and a bit years ago, one of the things they asked if I would look at for them was buyer and seller property information, and whether or not we could have upfront information, what impact that might have on the transaction. So they asked me if I would have a look at the BASPI, which is a set of data points, a set of questions, to see whether or not that could be digitised. So we got a group of people together who are all very technology focused, to say what would a digital version of this look like. And we very quickly came to the conclusion that actually there's a bit of a bigger problem in terms of needing something more around data and data standards, and actually having things available in a digital format in the first place, so you can then output them in the things that you need. So that created the technology working group. The technology working group which I chair has been running for 2 years. Amazing amount of input gone in from all of our volunteers and participants, again right across the industry, and we work really closely with the main home buying and selling group and the upfront information guys to make sure we're all aligned. And a big piece of what we do is around interoperability and making sure different solutions work together. And we've got to the point where we created standards, we created a JSON schema, we had firms who had tested it in a live environment, we did some proof of concepts and made sure that everything we'd done was kind of fit for purpose, and then got to the point where it's now so big and we needed governance and we needed structure, and we also needed funding. We needed to kind of make some commercial decisions about what we do with the framework going forward. So that's kind of how we've ended up with the Open Property Data Association, who've now taken over that work.
Thanks, Maria. And to perhaps rewind slightly and perhaps dig a little deeper into a phrase you've used there that might be worth explaining for people who are listening and viewing, is what do we mean by upfront information? Because clearly there's a lot of data around a property when you're buying and selling. What do we mean by the upfront information phrase?
Yes, there's a few things that have fed into that. The latest one being the trading standards guidance on what should be in parts A, B and C. So the things that are classed as material information, but there's also some other things that should be in an upfront pack or in a property listing that are have an impact on the kind of downstream experience of the buyer and the seller, but of course everyone in the industry who's then involved in the transaction. So we include things like the land registry title, the initial searches, which would identify whether or not a specialist search would be required. We include things like EPC rating and what council tax band it is, all of the things that you would consider would be material to somebody either viewing or transacting on that property. And the idea of an upfront information pack is that all of those things are collected at the point of listing in a digital format, in a way that the estate agent can then share with potential buyers, but also then with mortgage lenders, mortgage intermediaries, valuers, surveyors, conveyancers, and all of the other parties in the chain. So yes, the upfront information pack is everything that would be in trading standards A, B and C, BASPI part A and B, and then the other things that I mentioned around title and searches, etc.
Thanks, Marina. Moving to you, Ed, I guess what strikes me is, and I know this subject fairly well, obviously being on the working group as well, but this is a pretty big data set. So how are we going to capture all this data and share it? You know, when actually the rubber hits the road, how does this actually work?
Yeah, I guess the data is all out there, and what's challenging about the way the industry works is that it's probably one of the last bastions of the analog, isn't it? In the way that data tends to be shared around, it's the memorandum of sale, it's the TA6, which are the loosely speaking the APIs which connect things together, which is obviously not ideal. So the idea of the work that we've been doing is to firstly find a common way of describing all of this data. And there's no shortage of people out there with data. And obviously we like to go to the primary sources like land registry rather than through intermediaries, but we can find this data. The question is, can we communicate it in a way which is reusable around all the various stakeholders in the transaction? And also, how can we communicate the provenance of that data, which is what's missing from these other approaches that have been taken in the past? And the angle we've taken up very much is that it seems obvious to us that the only way of doing that, in a way that's going to be successful, is using open standards. There have been plenty of attempts in the past to build proprietary platforms, and people are indeed still trying to build them, but without some open standards which are vendor neutral and agnostic of all technologies, then we can't really expect to see adoption the way that we would like. So firstly, open standards around the way that we describe the data, and then an open API, application programming interface, to allow systems to have a single way of exchanging that as well. And to do that in a way that can be trusted by everybody, which is the kind of key component, especially when you get into the conveyancing process. You need to build something called a trust framework so that you can identify where data's come from and know that you can rely on the people participating in the transaction, the providers of the data, people handling it and displaying it, to do what they're supposed to be doing with that data, which is to keep it as accurate as it can be and represent its provenance properly.
So it sounds like that trust framework is a fairly key part, because you've used that word provenance, that sense of, knowing where the data's come from, knowing how it was collected, knowing the source, and knowing perhaps the recency and that kind of thing. That does feel like a very critical piece for people within this kind of ecosystem who are going to place various levels of reliance on the data.
It is absolutely. I think, in a way, of course, everyone wants to have the confidence that they need to be able to rely on data. And in a purely cynical way, you might say, who are we going to blame if things go wrong? So as long as we have traceability back through to its source, then we can work out who to blame. But ultimately, people are making big decisions about expensive properties and expensive insurance policies, and they need to be able to know that they can trust it. So one of the key things about the way that the property data trust framework works is that every piece of data is wrapped up in its provenance, if you like. And so one of the ways that we describe this is by thinking about the property data itself as a Christmas tree, if you like. And so it's the branches of that tree are the various different parts of data. It's an EPC rating, or it's a flood risk, or whatever it is. And when we have a piece of data, we think about that as being, a bauble that you might hang on the tree, and you know where to put it because the structure is defined by what we call the schema that describes all of these pieces of data. But importantly, on that bauble is a little label that says where we got it from. So what we really pass around as members of the ecosystem of this trust framework is really a bauble kit. It's a Christmas tree decoration kit. Everything is labeled. You can assemble your Christmas tree using all your data, but you can always see where something has come from. So there isn't at all another system out there in property data which allows you to represent both the breadth of the data that we're covering, but also its provenance in a sort of way that's built into the way that data is exchanged, which I think is super powerful, and it's the difference between what we're doing and what's happened before, I think.
Indeed, thanks, Ed. Moving to you, Tim. I mean, obviously, there's lots of people and participants involved in a property transaction, and I guess that's one of the challenges of the whole process. Do all these people need to use the property data and trust framework?
I mean, I think the common goal is that yes is the answer to that. It'll be fantastic when they do, but then people can dip in and out of it. It's been built so that that even if there are just two parties using it, it can be beneficial to those parties, even if the others aren't. So it's work in progress, and as more people use it, it'll become more beneficial.
Indeed. Now, I know, Ed, you mentioned the concept of open standards there, and Maria, perhaps you could tell me what's the challenge about who owns the development of the framework and the technical standards? How's that going to be maintained as an open, accessible standard to avoid the problems of these kind of walled gardens or proprietary solutions?
Yeah, and it's definitely one of the reasons that things have fallen down in the past, where we didn't have that kind of digital infrastructure that we have today. And it was before that, things that had been tried before. We had open banking or open finance or other ecosystems. So there's a lot of those problems that are now solved because technology has moved on so much, and the concept of having provenance data is really important. But there's a couple of other things that have happened recently as well. We've had the UK National Data Strategy that was published in 2020, which actually set out really clearly at a government level what we mean by digital in the future and what that means for public and private sources of data. And that actually sets out some of the work around things like fair data standards, which is how you describe property data for us in our very practical use case. So we look at how do we make data findable, how do we make it accessible, interoperable and reusable. And a big piece of the work that we've been doing at the Trade Association is working with the kind of primary sources of the data to work out where they are on their digital roadmap and where that data will be available in the format that ideally we would like it in. But in the meantime, we're kind of providing proxy for that. So we have a schema, as I said, that we're on version 2.1 now. It's all been voluntary, everybody's contributed to it. It's open source on GitHub, which means it's completely free under kind of standard licensing, no cost for anyone to use it. But in terms of the development community, they actually get to kind of test Manchester and find gremlins and tell us new things that they would like us to include. But in that, in the schema, we've included a bunch of overlays and kind of support tools that enable people to use it until we kind of get to that end game. So the Open Property Data Association now take responsibility for keeping the schema on a roadmap, folding in new sources of data as they become available, lobbying where we need to get data digitised, where we don't have a good source of data or we're relying on documents. We've had really good engagement for the likes of Land Registry, who have committed in their digital strategy 22+ to converting all of our title deeds and all of the kind of Land Registry documents into readable format, which is amazing. We've got the Local Land Charges project, who are well underway converting the local searches for local authorities, and we're working with a bunch of other people around smart data and private sources of data, all of that kind of thing. So the Open Property Data Association will continue to develop the schema and make sure that we get the data we need and that we continue to build on the code that's in there. But in terms of the contribution and who can use it, it's all available on GitHub.
And Ed, from your perspective, what does the sort of technical development look like in terms of making sure that that kind of two-way street between the market and obviously the people like yourselves who've been driving this development, is managed moving forward?
Yeah, so we're super keen on the open source model, but of course it's not. We don't want it to be the Wild West, and so the idea of the Open Property Data Association is it sets down the way that we govern how that collaboration works, and we put things into place like we have a get together next week with a bunch of surveyors and valuers from all sorts of different parts of the industry to talk about how we might think about extending the schema to include the use cases that you might have for a surveyor walking into the property for the first time, make sure they have what they need and so on, not have to do any rework. So open source models have worked spectacularly well in all sorts of different parts of other industries, provided they're managed correctly. And what you do get is you get access to this much broader range of resources in terms of people contributing things. You get to see people contributing things because they know they need it for their own purposes as well. So we have ourselves at Movely, we've got guys at Kahoot and Mio and Catini and all sorts of other organizations now contributing directly to the schema, which is obviously tremendous to see, and overarching all of that in terms of how we make sure that we're taking in the right direction, we are pulling in the right inputs from different parts of the industry, is where the Open Property Data Association itself comes in.
Great, thanks. Maria, what do you see as the next steps for the trust framework?
Yeah, so we've got a few use cases on the transaction to continue to extend out, one of which is around property valuation, property surveying, property inspections, which apply to a transaction but actually have quite a kind of longer life cycle for other scenarios. So we need to extend the schema out to that. Obviously, a huge part of what we do is to make sure that everything that we write is in line with things like international land standards, with the RICS own data frameworks, and we make sure that everything kind of works together and fits together. So valuations and surveys is the next one, and then we're going to work through mortgages and what it means for mortgage intermediaries and mortgage lenders, and how we start bringing in things like mortgage offer data, mortgage offer conditions, all of the things that we know impact on transactions. And actually, by the time we get to that point, which will be by the end of this year, that would be everything that we'd need for material information and to support a property transaction from beginning to end. And at that point for next year, we can start planning on what are all of the other open property use cases we might want to use. And that would be things like property logbooks, it would be things like refinance. There's a lot of work around the ESG agenda and how we track things like carbon neutral, how we track building safety. So I think we're going to end up with quite a long list of other use cases that we want to support. So one of the things that we're really cognizant on is that the standards that we create have to be reusable regardless of the scenario that they're being used for, which is why having an open standard is really important, but also making sure that that open standard remains consistent with other frameworks. And in an ideal world, you would probably end up with the perfect triangle of open finance data, open property data, and then your digital identity data, which actually unlocks a whole lot of really nice things for consumers and for industry partners to be able to offer nice products and services that are backed by trusted digital data.
Great, thanks, Maria. And Ed, back to you. I'm curious to know what kind of people are already beginning to sort of use this in anger, either in kind of beta mode in terms of building it into their systems, because clearly the proof in the pudding here is getting the various participants to start making this just part of their DNA in terms of the way their systems are talking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Not hopefully not too much anger, but maybe the opposite. And we spent a lot of last year really laying the groundwork in terms of proofs of concept and working with all of the different vendors in our group, just to make sure that what we were doing was on the right track. And with the release of version 2 in the summer, we now have real transactions going through. We're starting very much at the front part of the transaction, so upfront information, the BASB, the title deed, the EPC, and so on. And we have handoffs from estate agents to getting vendors involved, handing off to buyers, going on to conveyancers and taking on through the transaction, already happening in the real world with multiple systems. And the idea is we'll gradually march our way down the transaction until we can do a full end-to-end transaction, all using the schema in due course. But we're already making a good impact and learning a lot from a whole bunch of different vendors working at that upfront part of the transaction already.
Great. Now, I'm conscious that a lot of what we've talked about is that kind of sort of almost the plumbing, the kind of technical side, the trust framework, the schema. I'm interested to hear from all of you, actually, and perhaps if I start with you, Tim, is what's this going to feel like from a practical point of view and the impact for buyers, sellers, surveyors, other participants? Because obviously we want to, in some respects, almost hide the technology and let's just have a better experience. What do you think that experience is going to feel like practically?
Well, I think that's the focus. Is it's down to the consumer how they're going to use it, and actually that's really down to the delivering parties, because the actual consumer is probably going to now see a screen rather than a form. That's the big step. But those forms are going to look very different because there's a wide range of providers, and nobody's decreeing what it should look like. And so, as long as the questions and the data comes back in the standard format, they're going to look quite different from producer to producer. But the big difference is people are going to see a screen and complete things digitally rather than reams and reams of paperwork to fill in.
And Ed, what's your perspective? How do you think things are going to feel and look and progress differently for these various stakeholders?
Yeah, we very much come at it with the sort of consumer in mind. Obviously, there's a big gap between the kinds of things that consumers understand and the kinds of data that we have here, which is very, very detailed and granular. The entirety of a title deed or everything that's on an EPC isn't necessarily suitable for consumption by mere mortals. And so our focus is a lot on generating the insights that a consumer might want based on the data that's there. So, for example, what in there might impact my ability to get a mortgage? Is the lease term a bit short? Is there restrictions on what I might do in that property if I've got pets or I want to park my white van outside? And to be able to distill down these 3,000 odd data points into why should I care for both sellers, so they may be able to remedy some of these things, but absolutely for buyers, so they can work out whether this is the right property for them as early as possible. The transaction is where a lot of our work is focused, and that we can't do that without having a common way of describing these things that we're passing data around in, because we literally just couldn't pass it on to the buyer's conveyancer even if we wanted to. But being able to interpret it and to distill it down to things that people genuinely understand and things that affect them is where our work is.
So, Maria, finally, from you, what's your perspective in terms of how you think this will feel and look, and particularly from that consumer perspective, perhaps, how it's going to improve things?
Yeah, and it absolutely is focused on improving the process, because that's kind of where this all started, and it is absolutely where it ends. But improving it from the customer and the buyer and seller experience, but also the experience of our staff in the industry, because we know that a lot of what we do today is very much kind of wasteful resource, that we spend a lot of time rekeying things into different systems, that we spend a lot of time pushing paper, sending emails, being chased or chasing about where things are in a transaction. And actually one of the things that this really does solve is it turns that transaction absolutely on its head. So upfront information will absolutely be mandatory for property listings. Trading standards have been really clear about that. So the first thing the industry need to know is this is absolutely happening. This isn't just us going, field of dreams, we've built it, people will come. We're building this because the mandation of upfront information is going to be a reality. But what it does is it kind of unlocks then that whole process of not being reliant on documents, not being reliant on data capture, not having to manually send things to other parties in the transaction. So it massively increases transparency. It hugely increases trust because you know where that data has come from and you can verify it without having to go and do lots of manual lookups or manual checking of documentation. And that has really big impacts on efficiency and on resource and on transparency and on cost, and it actually gives everyone a much better experience. We ran 2 proof of concepts when we were testing this. I used my own transaction as our very guinea pig, and I did actually move my house. And we used upfront information and we shared it with the other transaction parties. And one of the things that evidenced was that we could really increase confidence of the buyer through the journey because they knew much more about what was going on. The seller was much more aware of what they needed to know about their property and instructed their conveyancer right up front, and being able to kind of flush out all of the things that stop transactions going ahead right now. So we had much less fall throughs, we had kind of less angst at the end of the process, and that has a huge knock-on impact then for mortgage brokers, lenders, valuers and surveyors, because actually their customers got a better experience of what's coming, but also they're better informed before they go and do their part of the process. So yeah, I mean, the impacts are absolutely huge.
And Tim, Maria mentioned, valuers and surveyors there, putting getting your crystal ball out. How do you see this impacting valuations and surveyors in the future as this gets adopted and rolled out?
Well, I wish I'd listed down Maria's list there of efficiencies, cost savings, time savings, everything else, because it covers it all. I mean, looking at valuations to start with, and certainly having in previous life got out the red book of the RICS to do my valuations previously. I mean, it's all about collecting information. And imagine if that information is there available and you even know where it's come from. I mean, how many times do we do pages and pages at the end of a report saying we got the information from here, here, and here? But it's just going to change life completely, even if 3/4 of it's available, but the time spent. So it's going to be so much more efficient, and valuers will be able to value things rather than be admin reps collecting the information. And surveyors, I think, there's another angle on it, in that we've been talking about a single transaction at the moment, but by the time you add the same process into logbooks and the same technology into logbooks, we see that this information should be available for the lifetime of the property. And imagine a surveyor going to survey a house and it's got a crack in the wall, and actually they can see that it was surveyed 5 years ago and 15 years ago, and the crack was the same. They're going to be less nervous about it than if they go and see the house for the first time and there's a big crack down the wall. If they can see it hasn't moved. And so history is going to build up in this information as well. So it will impact valuers and surveyors significantly to be able to see these records.
Indeed. And I think, Maria, I think it's your turn to turn the tables. I spend my life asking questions, and I think you've got a question for me.
I absolutely have. So obviously I come from a lending background, so Tim's absolutely right on the impact on surveyors, but also from a lender and surveyor practice. One of the things that really upsets us at the moment is the amount of post-valuation queries and nonsense to get at the end. And there's a lot of this we'll actually be able to get rid of, and we'll be able to get all of that. So I guess my question, Andrew, is what's the best way for RICS members to kind of understand what this means for them, but also to get involved and support it, but also to help us shape what that next stage looks like?
Yeah, and I think I'm part of it is to watch this video and understand what's actually happening. There's a big job for us all to raise awareness across the profession, but it is, I think, quite a profound issue that I think has been touched on before in this discussion, and I think Ed might have used the phrase that it's a very analog sector in the terms that we're still using, for better or for worse, a lot of paper. It might be effectively a soft copy piece of paper, but there's still that sense that we're comfortable and use bits of paper when we actually communicate and gather data. And I think this goes down to the real hub of the way the whole sector needs to think about, yes, producing output that's in that sort of form that people can read, but thinking more about using tools, gathering data, looking after data in a more structured way so that it can interface with these kinds of systems. So it's not a case of waving goodbye to a valuation report that you can read, to a survey report that goes out to a consumer, but thinking quite profoundly about how we gather data as a profession, how we manage that data, and realize that we do need to move away from this, as I say, analog, as Ed described it, way of doing things, and realize that we are going to be part of this ecosystem of connected systems where it's actually going to be much easier to collect data, playing to Tim's point about how powerful that will be for surveyors, but also when we're on the other end of the transaction, when we as a profession are providing data, there is that responsibility now to produce it in this structured way, make sure that the software that we buy, the software that we use is able to match these kinds of open systems. And it's not that surveyors need to become data scientists or programmers, but they need to make sure they're going to use software products and solutions that have these kind of APIs, these gateways into other systems. So I think it's all of benefit to the profession, and it's also some quite prosaic things about using UPRNs. You know, if you're going to do some work on a particular property, make sure you get the correct identifier for it so that we've got that unique property reference number, which, as we all know, makes it so much easier to join data sets together. But I think the first step, really, I think it is just raising awareness, getting behind it as a concept, understanding the benefit for us, and I think also overcoming, I think what is a particular challenge in the sector is a sense of not wanting to share data, both in terms of the technical challenge and sometimes the concerns around governance and ethics, but which can be overcome by the concept of a trust framework, that we can trust the data, that we're sharing it with appropriate people, that we're providing that provenance so that people know the level of reliance they can put upon it, but it's done in a well-governed, trusted way. I think Eddie used the phrase the Wild West. We want to avoid that. We want a governed way of sharing property data, because certain parts of the upfront data set can be considered to a degree to be sensitive or of a certain nature. And I think it's very important that we have that governance framework so that as a profession, we can technically learn how to share data, but also be comfortable that we're receiving and sending data in, as I say, a non-Wild West environment where it's governed, it's trusted, and everybody places the appropriate reliance on it. Well, on that closing note, it's been great to talk to you, and I think it's really important, as I've just said, for the profession to watch this and understand what's going on, and I wish the whole endeavour the best of luck to make sure we can get this embedded and make this whole process, which is so stressful, as we already know, as a home buying and selling process, much better in every respect. But thanks for your time today.